Hi, and welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. I'm Renee Williams, and I'm here with my co-host, Billy Thomas, and we are grateful that you are joining us today for another edition.
Yes, Renee, glad to have you all with us. We appreciate you all taking some time out of your busy schedules to join us. I think you will be well rewarded. We have a great program today, Renee. We've got one of our frequent guests that comes on, Dr. Amanda Gumbert. She's a water quality specialist here in our College of Agriculture, Food and Environment, and she's going to be talking about basically forested along the streams, the buffer areas around streams, the forested issues related to that. She's got some great videos and some slides she's going to share with us. So we're glad to have Amanda with us. We also have our own Megan Buland, who's going to be talking about mushrooms.
Growing them, yeah.
Growing them. And, she's got a little experience in that realm as well. So I'm looking forward to that segment. And then we have Dr. Jacob Muller, who's going to be talking about something that's really been on the thoughts and minds of a lot of people recently, and that is kind of carbon and markets for forest products and that type of stuff, and how all this carbon and forestry kind of come together. So Jacob's going to give us some good information on that. So glad to have you all with us. Appreciate you being here. If you have any questions or comments, please use the chat function if you're on Zoom. And if you're on Facebook Live, we will respond to the comment section there. So thank you all for being here today.
Yeah, so let's get started. Dr. Gumbert, are you available? There you are. Tell us a little bit about your segment today.
All right, so I'll go ahead and get my slides up so you can see those. And so we're going to talk about forested stream buffers. So if anybody knows me or has interacted with me, you might know that stream buffers are probably my very favorite practice to protect water quality. And so we're going to talk about using forested stream buffers in our woodlands, on our farms, and how to incorporate those into our Kentucky ag water quality plans. So we're gonna, I'll just get started talking a little bit about what stream buffers actually are. So there's lots of different names for buffers. Some folks, I typically default to riparian areas, although I'm trying to break myself of that and just say stream side buffer zones. That seems to be a little more clear to most audiences, but we also call them stream side management zones, or SMZs, in the forestry world. But they are simply a transition area between a water body and our upland land use. And so it could be a crop field, it could also be a woodland, it could be an area that where we have livestock in, or it could be even in an urban setting, it could just be a lawn or some other urban land use. So we typically have vegetation of trees, shrubs, grasses, and forbs, or those are the herbaceous plants, the plants that are non-woody. And a lot of times those are blooming. And so we like to have a variety of those plants. And I'll show you shortly what those zones might look like. But healthy stream buffers really protect our water resources. They're a great just a protector of the water body itself. And it just really does what the name says. It buffers what's going on in the adjacent landscape. So buffers can filter runoff water. Just the actual stems themselves, so the stems of the plants, can help slow water down, and then sediment will drop out of runoff. They can uptake excess nutrients. That's the NPK, or the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, that might be getting maybe being lost from the landscape and headed toward the water body. The roots hold soil in place and help protect stream banks from erosion. We've all seen some eroded stream banks and banks where you walk up to the edge of the creek and you think, oh my gosh, if I stepped one more step and fell in, I could get injured here. And so those stream banks, it's really important to hold those in place, because when we lose that sediment or that soil, it gets into our water bodies and creates water quality problems. These buffers can reduce flood damage. Really important, they provide shade to streams and help to cool or regulate water temperature. And that helps with our wildlife habitat and our aquatic habitat. there in the stream itself. And then also it can improve aesthetics. So lots and lots of benefits for stream buffers. So recently we met up with a landowner, a forested landowner who can tell us a little bit about buffers in the landscape, and can listen to a landowner speak firsthand.
This farm was put together by my grandfather over 100 years ago, and it was a farm both for woods products and for livestock and corn produce. I have a lot of memories since age 4. My father was in the military and we traveled around, but this was home. And during the Second World War, I spent a lot of time out here as a kid.
The Coons family manages this wooded farmland located in Bullitt County in the Knobs physiographic region of Kentucky. This land is drained by Crooked Creek and is part of the Salt River Basin. A portion of the original farm was sold to create Knobs State Forest and Wildlife Management Area. The Coons family manages about 300 acres with a focus on soil conservation, water quality protection, and wildlife habitat enhancement.
Okay, the knobs are interesting geological formation. Their formation goes back to about 300 million years. 300 million years. They're composed mostly of shale. They have iron deposits with them, which made them attractive for the iron industry in early Kentucky's history. One early spring, we had 10 inches of rain in about 10 hours. These whole fields were flooded. We had to hike out over the Scout Dam here. The first time the spillway had ever flooded, and I had to hold on my dog to keep it from being swept away downstream. So it really reflects the runoff that can happen in this type of topography. And this is why it's important to keep the forest sustainable.
Riparian areas link water bodies and aquatic environments with upland land uses. Riparian areas are also called buffer zones or streamside management zones. Buffers are useful on all sizes of streams, creeks, and rivers, and even on lakes and ponds. Vegetation is typically composed of trees, shrubs, grasses, and herbaceous perennials. Stream buffers are important elements of watershed management and offer benefits such as protecting stream banks from erosion, holding soil in place, taking up nutrients in runoff water, and reducing flood damage.
I also joined the Salt River Watershed Watch, and that made me very sensitive to what was going on the farm. We also participated in the water quality form, sent the form in, and have since then been very sensitive to livestock interaction with the stream. We fenced those out of the stream, which I think contributed to the low coliform counts that we've had on the stream.
Kentucky landowners with 10 acres or more involved in farming or forestry must develop a Kentucky Agriculture Water Quality Plan to comply with state law. Developing a plan includes selecting best management practices that will be utilized on the farm to protect soil and water resources. Streamside buffer zones and restricting livestock access to streams are effective practices to include in ag water quality plans. These practices not only protect resources on the farm, but also help protect water quality downstream.
We've stopped growing crops per se, and in our fields to provide a more broad environment and ecosystem for wildlife, we've planted them with native grasses and in more recent years, Forbes. And I'm tremendously interested in trying to preserve the monarch butterfly, and we planted and have naturally a lot of milkweed, and that's dear to my heart. Our whole approach to these attempts is to prevent erosion and preserve the quality of the stream. And having trees grow along the side of the banks tends to stabilize them, preventing silt, which would then impair the natural biologic activities that take place within the stream, the effect on the macroinvertebrates, and the fauna that lives in the stream.
To learn more about utilizing riparian buffers to protect water quality, contact your local Cooperative Extension Service office. To learn more about developing your Kentucky Ag Water Quality Plan, contact your local county conservation district.
Kind of emphasize a few things that Dr. Koontz had mentioned in the video. And excuse me, one of those is the Kentucky Ag Water Quality Act. And that just says if we're actively farming or harvesting trees, that we need to develop a water quality plan. The water quality plan is needed for applying for state cost share and also for applying for local cost share programs. And Dr. Koontz mentioned that they completed their form and with that created a water quality plan. The different sections of the water quality plan include livestock, crops, pesticides and fertilizers, farmsteads, forestry, like we mentioned, and then streams and other waters. And what you're doing when you create a water quality plan is you're creating a set of best management practices. And one of those is in the forestry section are streamside management zones. And so what these management zones do, we have guidance for timber harvest operations is based on the type of water body that is moving through the property. And in this diagram, the example is a perennial stream. Then your buffer or that streamside management zone where you're going to leave some trees intact is based on the slope of the land, like how the width of the buffer really depends on what the slope of that adjacent land looks like. And so you could imagine that as our slope increases, the greater likelihood we are to have runoff and not have infiltration into the soil. And so the greater the slope, pretty much the wider the buffer. In some cases, you can harvest some portion of trees near the stream, but there is there's guidance for leaving some of those trees intact so that they can provide shading to the stream and also to help hold soil in place and provide leaf fall so that we increase infiltration and have some of that water holding capacity for those soils on those greater slopes. And so again, those streamside management zones just protect soil and decrease erosion. They promote a higher infiltration rate. So and Dr. Koontz mentioned with the slopes that they have in the Knobs region, and the same thing for our mountainous regions of Kentucky, that the greater the slope, the more likelihood we are to have runoff. So having greater infiltration rates is really important so that we can help protect the stream that's right there, but also the streams that are on down the watershed and protect them from flooding issues. And then, of course, providing shade for streams. So this guidance is in the Ag Water Quality Act, as well as the forestry BMPs for harvest operations, for timber harvest. One thing I want to point out too that Dr. Koontz mentioned is when they no longer run livestock on their farm, but they were using a BMP in the livestock section to protect the streamside buffer areas. And I want to point out that you can also use this practice not just for livestock. This picture is a buffer that is in a cropping system, and we're going to get into like how it was established. But this one has some trees and small trees and shrubs, and also some herbaceous material there to help create a buffer. And so it's applicable to forestry practices, it's applicable to livestock operations as well as cropping systems. So you can develop an ag water quality plan by visiting your local conservation district for assistance. You can also develop your own plan. There is a new web-based tool, an online tool that you can use to develop that. I'm going to show a few slides about that, but really point folks to our College of Agriculture, Food and Environment Ag Water Quality Planning website. From this site, there is a link to a user guide that kind of gives you that overview of how to use the online tool. You can get straight to the tool. There is a printable version that if you would prefer to do it on paper, you can if you can get assistance to get that printed at the Conservation District office or our extension offices, or you can just do it all online if you like. It's fairly straightforward. You just create a login, and then you go to the Ag Water Quality Planning tool. You get a form that kind of looks like this, and if you're comfortable with completing online forms, digital forms, very straightforward. You do need your farm information, so you need your FSA number and then all of your address and landowner operator information. So yes, there is a printable version if you like that instead. Overall, the goal of the Ag Water Quality Act, as well as any of these VMPs, is that we have protected stream banks, and then those stream banks and those buffer zones help protect our water quality. So keeping in mind that we all live downstream from something, and our water is going to still flow downhill and contribute to a bigger water body. And in the case of Kentucky, our water all drains to the Mississippi River Basin, and we're part of that basin, and it ultimately drains to the Gulf of Mexico. So anything that we're putting in our water is eventually going to contribute to the quality of water that's in the Mississippi River, as well as ultimately the Gulf of Mexico. So if you can cue up our second video, we're going to listen to Dr. Kuntz talk a little bit about maintenance on stream buffers.
This is what is called a passive buffer, and it has naturally occurred over the years. So I did not actively plan it as the more formal or constructed riparian buffers are done.
Riparian buffers can be established by actively planting trees, shrubs, grasses, and perennials. This method may be more labor-intensive, but may help prevent competition from existing vegetation or unwanted plants in the seed bank. Buffers can also be established by passive management, which is allowing vegetation to come back on its own. These are often referred to as no-mow zones. Both establishment methods require long-term management. An unmanaged riparian buffer can quickly be taken over by undesirable plants such as invasive species.
We're very interested in keeping it intact and enhancing it. And to that end, as you can see, we are being invaded by vine honeysuckle. And this is typically what it does. It comes out early in the spring and stays late in the fall. And it grows on any vertical surface. And you can see behind me some of these gums are being overwhelmed by it. It's growing on the ground, and we're very dismayed by what it's done to our buffering trees that are volunteered here.
Buffer zones often consist of 3 zones of planted native species. Zone 1 includes moisture-tolerant plants, often trees, that provide shading to the stream. This shading helps regulate water temperature and keep temperatures at optimal levels for aquatic life. Zone 2 often includes shrubs that are moisture tolerant but not necessarily wetland plants. Zone 3 includes grasses and herbaceous perennials that are tolerant of moderate to dry soil conditions. In urban settings, it may not be possible to create this delineation due to space and visibility constraints, but it is a good idea to include trees, shrubs, grasses, and herbaceous plants. This variety of plant types helps create a healthy stream buffer habitat.
We tried to put the prescribed layers, having trees at the riparian, at the edge of the stream, and then bushes, and then the grasses. We planted dogwood, we planted wild plum. What happened, we have very hungry deer, and they came along and nipped the tips of these, and the plantings died. So this is why we have the situation here where we have trees, we have volunteering trees and grasses intermingled, and then our grasses that we planted in the fields. My response would be to observe early in the invasive plant process and nip it in the bud. We've ignored this and didn't realize how far it had gone.
Common invasive species in Kentucky's riparian buffers include bush and Japanese honeysuckles, winter creeper, Callery or Bradford pear, and Japanese knotweed. Mechanical or herbicide treatments may be necessary to control invasive species once they become established. Landowners should also monitor newly planted buffers for wildlife browsing. In the long term, buffers should be inspected on an annual basis to ensure plant growth and survival, and to identify any areas of concern such as invasive species, storm damage, or signs of erosion.
Overall, these attempts improve the quality of the water.
To learn more about managing riparian buffers to protect water quality, contact your local Cooperative Extension Service office.
Get our slides to advance. There we go. So establishing buffer zones, this is a question I get a lot of, okay, I want to do a buffer zone, so how do I do it? And you heard Dr. Coons in the video talking about some of the challenges with buffers. One of the first things that we want to do is determine what the width of the buffer will be. And I always say, I will take as much buffer width as you'll give me, but I also recognize that there are constraints and folks don't want to give up all of their land to a buffer. And so the thing we like to think about is with buffer width, the width is going to determine what benefits that we get from that buffer. So a minimum of 15 to 20 feet will give us some stream bank protection, but the wider the buffer, the greater the benefit that we'll get, including nutrient uptake and pesticide removal from runoff. And so I like to use this graphic, and especially the one at the bottom, those colored bars, just kind of give you an indication of the distance from the body of water. And as you increase the width of the buffer, you start picking up extra benefits. So that 10 feet is the minimum, really, and I say 15 to 20 if I can get it, but that's the minimum width of a buffer that we would need to give us some stream bank stabilization and water temperature moderation. So again, just keep in mind, the wider the buffer, the better. Other things we need to think about are planting strategy. Dr. Coons mentioned they did a passive buffer establishment, and then we saw a demonstration of someone actually planting a tree. When we do those planting strategies, we do want to control for unwanted vegetation prior to planting. That's one thing we didn't mention, is that sometimes it does require an herbicide treatment prior to planting so that we can reduce competition and give those trees an increase of survival rate in there. And if you do participate in a cost share program through NRCS, for example, they will give a prescription for steps to follow to ensure survivability of that planting. And then also with the maintenance strategy, we want to do inspections, we want to control for invasives, and as Dr. Coons mentioned, making sure that you're inspecting regularly and really identifying problems before they become really out of control. For herbaceous plantings, we might have mowing strategies that we employ. If you don't want to have woody vegetation, but you're okay to maintain a grass buffer, you can mow 1 to 2 times per year, but then we mow them in strips. So you might mow once a year, but then mow only 1/3 of that. And then you're mowing kind of in a 3-year rotation. And so that helps to provide wildlife habitat, but also give us our water quality benefit. A lot of it really comes down to what your desire is. So what is the goal for having that buffer, and what kind of tolerance do you have? The picture I'm showing you here, some folks would look at that and go, my gosh, what a weedy mess. And I just am like, yes, that's just, a buffer under development. So it just kind of depends on perception as well as what your goals are for protecting your water resources. And again, the desired function, how much time you've got, and what your resources are really are going to help determine that. You saw this graphic a couple times in the videos, and just a reminder that those are just how we delineate those zones, and always wanting to have trees up near the stream to help regulate water temperature and hold the stream banks in place. Some folks might just do a no-mow zone and keep it herbaceous. And this is an example of 1 year in a crop field setting of no mowing a stream. And so lots and lots of pollinators in there, wildflowers that attract pollinators. And I look at that and just like, my goodness, how beautiful that is. So that goes to that aesthetic benefit as well. This is a planted one, so it's one that's being very strategically planted. Dr. Coons mentioned monarch butterflies and having milkweed species there. And so having some of these specific things in place are really what we're looking for. But just keeping in mind, we have lots of benefits of healthy stream buffers, protecting the stream banks, filtering runoff, uptaking those excess nutrients, but really also a huge, huge wildlife benefit to having our stream buffers. So with that, I'm going to finish and stop my sharing. And thank you so much.
A lot of people probably say that, what I do to my property doesn't affect anybody else. That's not true.
No, it really isn't. We're all in this together, folks. I know that we are an independent sort, especially in the ag community, the forestry community, but really everything that we do affects our water quality, and that affects all of us. One of my colleagues at Division of Water always says, if it's on the ground, it's in your water. And that's really true. And that's a pretty simplistic way to look at it, but everything that we do impacts everybody else too. So
I was gonna say, Amanda, we have so much water here in Kentucky, right? I mean,
we've got a ton, so
many streams and rivers and creeks, and so everybody's probably got some water on their property. So
I am certain everybody does, but it also comes with a lot of responsibility. So we've got to be good stewards. Well, thank you.
Dr. Gumber, thank you for all you do to kind of keep our water safe and drinkable and usable here in Kentucky. Certainly appreciate your efforts.
Definitely.
Thanks.
All right. So moving on, we have a Megan Bulin talking about growing mushrooms. I'm really interested in how you actually grow a mushroom in a bucket. I saw those those mushrooms coming out of that bucket, and I was like, how does she do that?
Yeah, well, thank you all. Today we're going to be talking about growing your own mushrooms at home. So I don't know if this is something that maybe you've had some interest in before, or maybe you've tried it out with one of those at-home grow kits that you can buy. But today we're going to be going a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of exactly how this works. And you're going to see that it's actually really easy and straightforward to be able to grow your own mushrooms at home. Okay. So if you want to grow your mushrooms at home, it's a pretty easy and straightforward process. But you might think that it's a little complex. You're imagining, how do you get from this little pure culture, this plate of fungal culture, to beautiful mushrooms that you can grow and cook with and enjoy at home? Well, it's pretty easy and straightforward. And today we're going to go over the essentials of what it is that you need to grow your own mushrooms, whether you have acreage and a wood lot to work with, or maybe you just have a little patio on an apartment porch. No matter what kind of space you have, this is something that you can do. So the first thing that you want to consider is you want to look at the substrate. And substrate means what that mushroom is growing on. Now, mushrooms, most of them that we enjoy eating are saprophytes. That means they feed on dead and decaying material. So you want to give that mushroom a nice, delicious food source that it can use for the fungus to grow and thrive and start to fruit and make mushrooms that you can eat. A lot of mushrooms are going to want some kind of a hardwood source, and hardwood pellets, premium hardwood pellets, are a fuel source that people sometimes utilize to grow mushrooms. Now, when you're using pellets, you want to be sure that they're certified hardwood only, usually from sawdust from a mill. You want to be sure there's no softwood in there, because a lot of softwoods have secondary compounds that you don't want your mushrooms to be consuming if you're going to eat them. And also that there aren't any wood byproducts used like old pallets in making those pellets, because there can be a lot of harmful chemicals in there as well. But premium hardwood pellets are a great substrate source that you can use to grow shiitake, Hericium, and some of your other hardwood loving mushroom species. You can also, of course, use logs, and I think that this is a method that a lot of people are really familiar with. Shiitake cultivation is primarily done on logs, and you can see these totems of shiitake logs stacked up with all of the shiitake pellets drilled into them for cultivation. And you can even see that some of the shiitake are fruiting here. So those are a good choice. You can also use sawdust that we use and create these like blocks, these wood blocks. And a combination of sawdust and compost is used to grow some species like the agaricus button mushrooms that you see in the grocery store, the little traditional like pizza mushrooms that you see. And they can also be utilized to grow, so again, some of those hardwood loving species like shiitake, Hericium, or lion's mane, as well as oyster mushrooms. And finally, you can use straw as well. And straw is a really great substrate to use when you're just getting started with growing your own mushrooms, especially oyster mushrooms. And we'll talk about this more in a little bit. But straw is an easy to source and cheap, reliable substrate that you can utilize and acquire pretty easily for growing mushrooms. Now, you don't want hay. It has too much nutrients in it. You want just plain old straw, not alfalfa or anything like that. And you can use a wide variety of other substrates as well that might not be so accessible here, but these are other options that you can look at. Things like corn cobs, cocoa coir, and even coffee grounds can be used for growing mushrooms. The second consideration that you want to keep in mind is pasteurization. When you have that substrate, whether it is straw or wood chips, you might want to sterilize it or pasteurize it in some way before you inoculate it with your fungi. Think of it as real estate. And there's all kinds of microbes that want to take up the real estate of whatever that substrate might be. But you want everybody cleared out so that those fungi have a nice available place to grow and to colonize your substrate. So you want to knock out all the other microbes that might be living in there. You can do this in a couple of ways. Cold pasteurization is a method that I really like. This is very passive. You don't need any specialized equipment. All you need is a bag of hydrated lime and a large, clean trash can or other receptacle to soak your straw or other substrate in. And this lowers the pH. It elevates the pH. It changes the pH of your substrate and the water that it's soaking in, and helps shock and kill off a lot of those microbes. This is the method that I use at home. It's incredibly reliable. I've very rarely had any contamination issues using this method. It's cheap and it's safe. So this is a method that I can highly recommend. And the other method that you can utilize other than cold pasteurization, like you see here, is you can use heat pasteurization. But this is a little bit more technical. It involves having a heat source, a fuel source, and the safety measures to be able to do this in a safe and effective manner to essentially boil that substrate and kill off all of those microbes in it. The other option for heat pasteurization that might be a little bit more accessible at home is going to be to use a pressure cooker. And I do this occasionally with some substrates, but in smaller batches and smaller amounts, you can use a pressure cooker to heat pasteurize or sterilize, to sterilize that substrate. And this is an option that is available to a lot of people. The second thing you want to consider is your fungal culture. The culture is, it's the seed source, for lack of a better word, that you're going to use to grow your mushrooms. And your fungal culture is something you're going to want to acquire from a reputable provider of mushroom-related resources, and there are a few really good resources out there. But you can use grain spawn, which is what you see a lot with oyster mushrooms, and occasionally with some other fungi as well, but oyster mushrooms especially are often grown on grain spawn. It's very nutrient rich. And you can use this to inoculate your straw or your sawdust that you're growing your mushrooms on. You can also use sawdust spawn, and this is seen especially with oyster mushrooms and with shiitake mushrooms. Those mushrooms that you might be growing in logs, there's specialized equipment that people who grow mushrooms on a larger scale will use to hole punch that sawdust spawn into holes in the logs that they've drilled to grow their mushrooms. This is a little bit more high tech, and it's usually for people who really are invested in mushroom growing on a larger scale. Dowels are also a great choice for shiitake cultivation, and these are pretty exclusive to shiitake, at least in our region, where these little wooden dowels have been inoculated with the mycelium, and those can then just be hammered into holes that you drill in those shiitake logs. It's very easy. You don't need a lot of specialized equipment other than a little handheld power drill, and a very accessible method, again, for most people to utilize. And then you have things like liquid cultures and pure cultures, which most people won't be doing at home. You'll see this in larger scale mushroom operations and for people who might really be getting down into the nitty gritty of mushroom cultivation. You also need a receptacle, something to grow your mushrooms in. Now, we've talked about logs, and that's a great receptacle if you have the outdoor space for growing shiitake or oyster mushrooms. You can also utilize buckets, and actually this is what I do personally at home. I have a bunch of 5-gallon buckets with holes drilled in them that are stacked up under the porch, and I grow oyster mushrooms in them on straw. It's a great method to utilize if you don't have very much space, maybe only a little backyard or a patio to work with, and those buckets are very easily sterilized and cleaned out between rounds of growing mushrooms. This is a really nice method to utilize for space restrictions. People will also utilize jars. Again, this is usually in more large-scale production, especially in other parts of the world. Mushrooms like enoki mushrooms that you can see here are grown in large quantities in these jars. That's another option. Grow bags and grow blocks are usually utilized by people who have more of a business growing mushrooms, where this is something they do on a larger scale. Although you can also buy these blocks pre-inoculated from reputable growers if you just want to be able to set something on your kitchen table. It's already ready to go, and just watch those mushrooms grow and then enjoy the tasty benefits. And finally, if you really get into mushroom growing, you can always be creative. There are all kinds of interesting receptacles that you can utilize to grow mushrooms in. I've seen some very curious ones. This is a great method to utilize with kids, just a little 2-liter Coke bottle cut in half. But there's a lot of variety. That's one of the things I love about mushroom growing, is you can really get creative with what you're doing to tailor it to your own curiosity, as well as the means and materials you have available to you, even laundry baskets. And finally, location. You need a location in which you can grow your mushrooms. And this is one of the factors that is most contingent upon the resources available to you. If you have a lot of outdoor acreage, you might be able to grow shiitake or oyster mushrooms on logs. If you have a wood lot, you have a wood source available to you and a space to stack those logs, this might be a great option for you. But it might be that you don't have that kind of resource availability. You can grow some mushrooms just out in your garden on hardwood chips. Again, you don't want softwood here, no pines or spruces, anything like that, but nice hardwood chips can be utilized to grow some mushrooms like Stropharia, just straight out in your garden. And these don't even need to be pasteurized for the wood chips first. You can just go ahead and sow the mushroom spawn in there. And this is a great thing to do with like community garden spaces, with children's gardens, and with a variety of groups. And finally, like we talked about, if you just have patio space or a small garden space available, there's still things that you can do to be able to grow mushrooms on your own. You just need to get a little creative with what it is that you want to do. And you also want to consider the temperature and the climate in the area that you are living in. Oyster and shiitake mushrooms especially have been in cultivation for a long time. And as such, there's a wide variety of strains available that are tolerant of different temperature ranges. And you can grow mushrooms, at least in our area, at least spring through fall. In the middle of winter, that kind of drops off. There's not a whole lot that can fruit then, but otherwise you can fruit and grow these two types of mushrooms almost year round in our region. So finally, I wanted to talk briefly about 3 mushrooms to get started with for at-home cultivation that are really reliable. Oyster mushrooms are a great place to start. These are the first mushrooms that I started cultivating. They're reliable, they're delicious, and there's a wide variety of strains available. So there's a variety of colors and textures that you can purchase from reputable providers to grow on your own. Strophareas or wine caps are also a really great mushroom to grow at home. These can be grown on wood chips or on straw. They don't require any pasteurization or sterilization of that substrate, just nice fresh wood chips, not something that's been sitting around a long time, or a fresh bale of straw. I actually sow these in my garden beds just in between the rows and wood chips, and they fruit every year. They're a wonderful addition to the garden, and they're also great soil builders to help enrich and grow that garden soil. They require a little more space than those oyster mushrooms that can be grown in buckets, but really reliable, really easy. And of course, we all know about shiitake. It's the second most commonly produced mushroom in North America. It can be produced on logs or sawdust blocks. It takes longer for this mushroom to colonize its substrate than the Stropharia or the oyster mushrooms do. And it tends to only fruit in this cooler season in the spring and winter, but still a really great option for at-home cultivation. Thank you so much for joining us for this presentation today. If you'd like to learn more about mushrooms, I'd encourage you to check out our University of Kentucky mushroom blog with Dr. Crocker here in the Forest Health Lab and myself. And I hope that you enjoy growing some mushrooms.
I loved your last slide. That was amazing.
Yeah, great segment, Megan.
Yes.
You've got me excited. I'm telling you, we're going to be growing mushrooms in the Thomas household before we know it. So.
Well, thank you very much for that. I loved your presentation, and I'm interested in growing mushrooms now myself. So.
I know, man. We've got so many great people on our team doing really interesting stuff. So really nice segment. Yeah. So speaking of great people, great team members, Dr. Jacob Muller. So Jacob, you've been keeping up a little bit with what's going on with kind of carbon and forestry, and you're going to share some information with some of our audience today.
I am, yep. It's a very condensed version. As you can imagine, it's a pretty big topic, and we're continuing to learn more and more about it as we go. But hopefully today we can kind of introduce you to a couple topics to get you thinking about it, some of the potential and maybe some of the challenges that lie ahead. So. Today's talk is about carbon markets and opportunities for Kentucky woodland owners. So again, I'm Dr. Jacob Muller. I'm an assistant professor of hardwood silviculture extension here in the department. And so we've heard this word, carbon, a whole bunch of times lately. It's been a big topic in the forestry world, and agriculture world, and beyond. And it can be a confusing topic for a lot of us as we're thinking about some of its applications and some of the benefits to it. But I think it's important that we step back and kind of answer this question: why is everyone talking about carbon? And it's important to put this into context, right? And so we look at the trajectory of carbon emissions into the atmosphere, right? And so we're following this gray line on the left figure. If the amount that we emit into the atmosphere doesn't really change, we're kind of continuing to follow this little orangish red line here, increasing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Some of the initiatives that have been proposed and some of the large corporations they've made initiatives themselves to reduce the amount that they are emitting into the atmosphere. But when we look at this graph on the left, we see this trend, right? The relationship between carbon in the atmosphere and the temperature is well studied and well supported. And so again, we have these same trajectories where a higher amount of emissions is leading towards a higher overall temperature, and that can have all sorts of effects down the road in different systems, from temperature to precipitation to kind of how different large storms that we're seeing and droughts, how all that kind of plays into this. And so this is really what we're talking about, is all these initiatives focused around carbon. Our goal is to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, right? And so what is being done to reduce the amount of that carbon? There's some big, bold plans out there, right? Some large companies, energy companies such as ExxonMobil are investing billions of dollars into infrastructure to capture and store carbon deep down in these impermeable layers of the earth, right? These are big projects. And I won't begin to try to act like I know all of the ins and outs of these large development, or these developments with carbon storage and capture, right? But what I do know a lot about is trees and forests, right? And this is something that we're talking a lot about, is the relationship between forests and carbon, and how we can use forests and forest management in particular to help us store and capture that carbon. And then I'll talk about some of the opportunities associated with that. But the advantages of thinking about forests as this amazing tool for storing carbon is forests have been doing this for as long as there's been plants and forests on this earth, right? They've perfected the art of capturing and storing carbon. There's not any large infrastructure, these big plants that are capturing carbon, right? We can, just through forest management, we can improve the way that carbon is stored and captured in or on the earth, right? In forestry, it's an established science. Right? Foresters and others have been thinking about how we manage forests for long-term sustainability for hundreds of years. Right? And industry is leading a lot of initiatives in this particular field of forestry, carbon-focused forestry. Right? It's long-term storage, and there's lots of co-benefits with managing for sustainability, right? Obviously, oxygen is one of those, but we can also increase a whole suite of different forest resources, from increasing biodiversity, recreational opportunities, improving water, and wildlife habitat. So these are all co-benefits that we can manage for as we're thinking about carbon storage. Okay? So backing up just a little bit, thinking about how trees actually capture the carbon, right? We know, or at least a lot of us have heard from our early ecology or science courses of this process called photosynthesis. Right? And this photosynthesis process is when a plant absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere, right? And then also uptaking water from their roots. And this is combined with light, and all plants need light, right? And what happens is those carbon dioxide and those water molecules join and go through this photosynthesis process, and it produces sugars, right? And then the other byproduct is oxygen, right? We know that trees and plants take in carbon dioxide, and then they release oxygen. But a byproduct of that is these sugars, right? And you'll see in that chemical formula right there, there's 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms. That 6 carbon atoms is where that carbon goes from the carbon dioxide. It's stored in the trees, right? Not all of it's stored, but a lot of it is, and some of that is released back into the atmosphere as well. Okay. So when we're looking just at trees and how trees store carbon, wood is the #1 carbon stock in a tree, right? We can look at different carbon models. Soil is generally the largest component of the forest ecosystem where carbon is stored, but the wood in a tree is where, if we're just talking about the tree, where a majority of that carbon is stored, and it's stored for long term, right? The age of the tree. The roots are the next largest store of carbon in the tree, and then the leaves, right? Leaves are the least amount. Only about 1% of carbon is stored in the trees, and in deciduous forests, we know that it's a continual seasonal cycle of growing and dropping leaves and decomposing, right? It's also important to think about the stages of development when we're talking about forest carbon. Right? Young forests, they grow rapidly, but there's also a lot of competition, and trees grow and die. There's not a lot of biomass for carbon storage. So small trees have a limited amount of carbon that they can store, but they are good at sequestering, right? They're good at pulling in carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere because there's a lot of rapid growth happening in young forests. Mature forests are kind of the sweet spot where they're continuing to grow and develop, but their growth is slowed, right? There's less, a lot of the trees have become established that are going to be established in the forest at stand. They're the best at sequestering carbon, some mortality, but these large trees are the best at storing carbon, right? And then we have old growth. And this isn't to say that old growth isn't important, because it is for so many other reasons. But when we're talking about forests that have reached their peak, and you could say their culmination age, where their growth begins to slow over time, there's not a lot of net growth happening in forests. They're relatively poor at sequestering because of the mortality and the decay, but they're still good at storing forests. And so there's a place for all of these different stages of forest development. Different forest types, not all forests are created equal, at least when we're talking about carbon. Again, rainforests are fast growing and rapidly decaying, and so they're not great at long-term storage. The same with the boreal forest, kind of on the other end of the spectrum, where they're growing slowly, slower decay. And they're also good at storing carbon. But these temperate forests, these forests that we find here in Kentucky with moderate growth, moderate to slow decay, depending on where this forest is located, these are excellent forests to store carbon. Right? So quick summary of forest carbon. Trees are great at sequestering and storing carbon. Forests sequester and store carbon in the trees and in the soil. And when we think about managing for carbon, a lot of that is focused towards young, early successional forests, and watching or managing them as they grow into mature forests and managing those. And then temperate forests are really a key for a successful impact. Okay, so just real quickly, how do we grow carbon? Well, we keep forests as forests. We protect the health of the forest, encourage growth. So that's managing the forest to enhance the potential growth of that forest, and sustainable management. I'll say this over and over again, that sustainable management is so important for a number of reasons. But going back, keeping forests. So building relationships with the forest, interacting with the forest. If you're a woodland owner, getting out, interacting, learning about your forest, and getting a management plan set in place. Planning for the long term, legacy planning, thinking about maintaining the forest, right? And then financial incentives, and we're going to get to this here in just a second. It's important to know that not every place is suitable for a tree, right? There's a number of initiatives, plant a billion trees, and these are great, but it might be encouraging folks to plant trees where, or at least certain species where they aren't going to grow well. And so what ends up happening is there's a failure in those plantings and more CO2 is released. And so being aware of the types of soil and climate and where those trees are best located is ultimately the best course of action. Protecting forest health, we talk about this all the time. Invasive plants, they limit the natural component of the forest, reducing growth, and they can disrupt the function of the forest. Keeping an eye for pests that can slow down the growth and cause mortality in the forest, and a whole suite of other threats that we see in our woodlands. And so here's the key, right? Sustainable forest management is carbon-focused management, right? So keeping forests as forests, sustainable wood products that store carbon, protecting forest health, and other sustainable forest harvesting practices. Okay. So real quickly, touch on some of the opportunities, right? Carbon markets aren't necessarily new, but they haven't been accessible for a wide range of landowners. So most programs are set up for larger land holdings, right? 1,000 to 2,500 acres minimum for a lot of these. But there's been a push recently to open up the markets to smaller woodland owners, right? And so there's really two markets that we're seeing enter into the area, into Kentucky here in the next year or two, where a lot of these will be realistic. One of these is a company called NCX, or Natural Capital Exchange. And this is a timber deferment. So they're signing up for 1-year contracts to essentially delay the removal of forest products. And so that ultimately they're encouraging more storage on the landscape and getting folks to think about forest management. Right. As you can see here, it's primarily been set up in the south of Kentucky. So Texas and Louisiana and Alabama are kind of the big states that have entered into these programs so far, but they are expanding. And you can see here in this map the enrolled acreage by county, and a lot of that is south, but they're expanding that into our area. Okay. The next program is called FFCP, the Family Forest Carbon Program. Okay. And this is a program that's supported by the American Forest Foundation, the Nature Conservancy. It's got a lot of support, and the whole point of this is to allow small woodland owners to gain access to these markets while managing for their forest resources, including timber. Right? And so there's a couple different programs, growing mature forests, which is the goal is to maintain forests, and it even allows up to 25% harvesting of the initial basal area or density of the forest. And then another program enhancing future forests. And this is really providing resources to offset the costs of doing management, so that ultimately you're creating a more sustainable forest that's going to capture more carbon. And so there's two programs with this. There's a lot of detail with both of these programs, and they're making their way towards Kentucky. This program was piloted in Pennsylvania, and so we're learning a whole bunch of information about how the rollout for this program went in Pennsylvania. So hopefully we can troubleshoot or take the best course of action when we do have access to that, which will be soon. I'd like to do a little bit of compare and contrast between these two. And I don't expect you to, from this talk today, to be able to decide if this is right for you, but hopefully it kind of gets the wheels turning a little bit and start thinking about some of these things. But the family forest is practice-based. There are longer contracts, 20 to 30 years, and it's paid over the course of the contract. Minimum acreage is 30 acres and allows active management. Right, the NCX, again, that timber deferment or harvest deferment rather, is a 1-year contract. So you're essentially they're renting your forest for a year to keep that carbon there, right? And so a lot of these markets are set up and they're paid from large companies that are trying to offset their carbon footprint. Right? There's no minimum acreage for this, and it allows for other types of management. And this NCX program is all remotely sensed. And so you go to their website and you sign up, and then they can essentially do everything from the computer, where they can assess your woodland from remotely sensed satellites or satellite data to develop or to determine what sort of opportunities you might have. Okay. And there's other programs for those with larger landowners that I've mentioned before, that there's a number of resources. And there's a few other opportunities for smaller woodland owners, those less than 2,000 acres. And I'll just mention that the two that I mentioned earlier, the FFCP and the NCX, are the two primary options for smaller land ownerships that you're going to see. And so some final thoughts, at least that I have related to forest carbon, is healthy, sustainably managed forests retain carbon in their biomass, right? And they prevent a lot of emissions into the atmosphere. So when we promote sustainable management, we're also promoting clean air, water, soil, and that can go a long ways in reducing the amount of atmospheric carbon, right? And by tapping into these markets, landowners might be able to earn some additional money from their carbon offsets while still managing their forests. So that's really, I think, the most exciting thing is that it can support woodland owners, and it can support or perhaps even get people excited about managing their forests, some incentives to get a forest management plan in your own woodland. But I'll end with this. There's still lots of uncertainty. We're learning again from that Pennsylvania pilot study and others, and how that will roll out here in Kentucky, and we will stay on top of that and disseminate information as that comes. If you have more questions about it or they come up, you can contact me at my email there, jacob.muller@UKY, and we will be rolling out some additional resources here in the near future. I know we went over 12.
That's all right.
Hey, it's good stuff though.
Stuff.
Yeah, and important for so many of our woodland owners, here in the state. I know a lot of them are struggling with, what should I do? Which one should I jump in or not? And good information, Jacob. And I know, as you said, it's changing and will continue to kind of evolve. So,
yeah, I give a talk, and most times that talk is an hour or longer. And so condensing that to 15 or 20 minutes, certainly have to remove some of that detail. And so please feel free to reach out with any questions, and just know that this is on the way. Yeah. This is going to be something that folks are talking about. So.
We have a question of, are there many woodland owners in Kentucky that have used either platform?
Well, as I mentioned, we're really at the infancy of this here in Kentucky. So these programs are going to be rolling out. They haven't set an actual date with the American Forest Foundation, but the last I heard is it's coming soon, right? I don't know if, Billy, if you've heard anything recently, but I've kept an eye on that, and it's one of those things where it's coming. We know it is, and it's not fully here yet. And so the goal is to really get this information out, and so that we can stay on top of it when it does roll, and we can get folks signed up who want to be signed up, and hopefully help support them.
So stay tuned is basically
Yes.
what you're
Stay
saying.
tuned, and be sure that we will be the first to let you know when there are opportunities here.
Wonderful.
Excellent.
Well, thank you for your presentation. We greatly appreciate it.
You bet.
Yeah.
Always great to be here.
Yeah, it was good. Good stuff. Renee, we covered a lot of good stuff today.
We did, Billy. You know what? One thing that I think we definitely determined is whether it's water or air or land in your trees, whatever you do does affect other people.
It is. Yeah, we're in this together, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, and that's one of the great things I love about being part of this team is we get to try to help and support people to take care of their woodlands and their natural resources. So don't hesitate to reach out to us if you all have questions about any of this, and we'll try to connect you as appropriate. You can fill out a quick little survey if there's topics you'd like to see on fromthewoodstoday.com, and we'd be happy to try to entertain some of your thoughts about some future programming efforts. But another great show, Renee.
Definitely. All right. Well, we have went past time, so we're going to let you go. We greatly appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next week at 11 o'clock. Take care.